The fractures had always been there, hairline cracks in the structure of German military leadership, but in the summer of 1944 they began to widen into chasms that would consume the Third Reich from within. The conference room in the Wolf's Lair, once a place where coordinated military strategy was at least theoretically possible, had become an arena where rival factions of the German High Command waged their own war, not against the Allies closing in from all sides, but against each other. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt sat at one end of the massive table, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. At the opposite end, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel maintained the intense, sharp focus that had become his trademark response to the chaos engulfing German military planning. Between them, various generals, staff officers, and party officials occupied positions that reflected not military hierarchy, but political allegiance, personal ambition, and the complex web of rivalries that had transformed the German military command structure into a dysfunctional labyrinth of competing authorities. The immediate crisis was the situation in Normandy, where Allied forces had broken out of their beachhead and were racing across France with a speed that recalled Germany's own Blitzkrieg victories of 1940. But the real crisis, the one that would prove more devastating than any tactical defeat, was the complete breakdown of unified command that had turned the German military leadership into a collection of feuding warlords more concerned with protecting their own positions than with coordinating an effective defense. The roots of this internal conflict stretched back years to the very structure Hitler had imposed on the German armed forces. Rather than creating a unified command system with clear lines of authority, the Führer had deliberately constructed overlapping and competing chains of command that ensured no single military leader could accumulate enough power to threaten his own position. The Wehrmacht was divided into the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, theoretically commanding all German armed forces, and the Oberkommando des Heers, commanding only the army. The Luftwaffe operated as Hermann Göring's personal empire. The SS had its own military formations, answerable only to Heinrich Himmler. Various other organizations maintained their own armed units. This Byzantine structure had been problematic even in the years of German victory, but as long as the Wehrmacht was winning, the inefficiencies could be overlooked. Field commanders could compensate for poor coordination from above through tactical excellence and operational initiative. But by 1944, with Germany fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with overwhelming material superiority, the lack of unified command had become catastrophic. And rather than forcing cooperation, the mounting disasters had triggered a desperate scramble for scapegoats, credit, and survival that turned German generals against each other with a viciousness they rarely showed toward the enemy. The feuds operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There were ideological conflicts between traditional Prussian military professionals and Nazi true believers. There were institutional rivalries between the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Luftwaffe. There were personal animosities between generals who detested each other. There were struggles over strategy between those who wanted to trade space for time and those who insisted on holding every meter of ground. And underlying everything was the corrosive knowledge that Hitler blamed his generals for every setback while taking personal credit for every success, creating an environment where generals protected their own positions by undermining their colleagues. The conflict between the traditional officer corps and the Nazi faithful had been building since the 1930s. Old-line generals like Rundstedt and Manstein represented the Prussian military tradition, professional, aristocratic, focused on operational excellence, and deeply uncomfortable with Nazi ideology. They had made their peace with Hitler's regime because it offered them the opportunity to rebuild German military power and avenge the humiliation of Versailles. but they had never fully embraced Nazi socialism. They viewed themselves as professional soldiers serving Germany rather than as Nazi revolutionaries serving the Führer. Against them stood officers whose careers were built on Nazi loyalty rather than professional competence. Men like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl had risen to positions of authority by telling Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than providing independent military judgment. They were joined by SS officers like Sepp Dietrich and Paul Hauser, whose Waffen-SS divisions had grown from Hitler's bodyguard into a parallel army that competed with the Wehrmacht for resources, prestige, and the Führer's favor. These Nazi loyalists viewed the traditional officer corps with suspicion, seeing them as potential traitors whose commitment to Hitler was questionable. The tension between these factions had been manageable when Germany was winning. Professional officers could focus on operational matters, while the Nazi faithful handled the political aspects of military policy. But as the situation deteriorated, each side blamed the other. The professionals argued that military disasters stemmed from Hitler's interference and the promotion of party loyalists over competent commanders. The Nazi faithful countered that traditional officers lacked the ideological commitment necessary for victory, that they were defeatists and possibly traitors who sabotaged operations to undermine the Führer. These accusations were not entirely groundless on either side. Some traditional officers had indeed begun to doubt whether Germany could win the war and had started considering ways to end it short of total destruction. A few had gone further, joining the conspiracy that would culminate in the July 20 assassination attempt against Hitler. Meanwhile, some Nazi loyalists had indeed achieved positions beyond their competence through political connections, and their insistence on ideologically driven strategy over military logic had contributed to numerous disasters. The institutional rivalries added another layer of dysfunction to German military planning. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring's increasingly erratic leadership, operated as a virtually independent entity. Göring's status as Hitler's designated successor and his control over Germany's air force gave him enormous power, which he used to protect the Luftwaffe's interests even when they conflicted with overall military strategy. When army commanders requested air support, they had to negotiate with Luftwaffe officers who answered to Göring rather than to the Wehrmacht command structure. The result was constant friction, with army generals blaming the Luftwaffe for inadequate support, while Luftwaffe commanders accused the army of not understanding air power. The relationship between Göring and the Wehrmacht generals had deteriorated into open hostility by 1944. Göring blamed the army for losing territories from which the Luftwaffe could operate effectively. Army commanders blamed Göring for his increasingly absurd promises about what air power could accomplish. At Stalingrad, Göring had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped Sixth Army by air, a promise that proved catastrophically false. Yet Göring faced no consequences for this failure, while army generals who had warned the promise was impossible had been dismissed or worse. The SS's control over paratroop forces created additional conflicts. These elite infantry formations, organized as Luftwaffe field divisions despite being ground combat troops, operated under Air Force command, even when fighting alongside Army units. This meant that Army commanders could not directly order these troops and had to coordinate through Luftwaffe channels, leading to constant disputes about command authority. The absurdity of Air Force officers commanding ground combat operations was obvious to everyone, except Göring, who jealously guarded every prerogative of the Luftwaffe. Göring's personal corruption and incompetence had become increasingly obvious by 1944, but his position as Hitler's designated successor made him politically untouchable. He spent more time acquiring art treasures for his personal collection than managing the Luftwaffe. He issued orders based on ignorance of operational realities and refused to accept information that contradicted his preconceptions. His morphine addiction affected his judgment, leading to bizarre decisions and erratic behavior. Yet Wehrmacht generals who pointed out these problems found themselves accused of disloyalty rather than seeing Göring held accountable. The SS presented an even more complex challenge. Heinrich Himmler's organization had grown from a party security force into a massive empire encompassing police, intelligence, concentration camps, and increasingly combat formations. The Waffen-SS had expanded from a few elite divisions into an army of nearly 40 divisions by 1944. These units were generally well-equipped, receiving priority for new weapons and equipment, which bred resentment among Wehrmacht officers whose divisions made do with older equipment. The SS units also operated under their own command structure, answering to Himmler rather than Wehrmacht commanders, creating coordination nightmares when SS and Army units needed to cooperate. The preferential treatment of SS divisions was a constant source of friction. When new Panther or Tiger tanks came off the production lines, SS divisions received them first. When replacements were allocated, SS units were brought up to full strength before Wehrmacht divisions received reinforcements. When fuel was scarce, SS units somehow maintained adequate supplies, while Wehrmacht units sat immobilized. This created a two-tiered military where SS formations maintained combat effectiveness while Wehrmacht divisions gradually degraded through lack of resources. Wehrmacht generals understood the political reality that SS divisions were party troops enjoying special favor, but understanding did not reduce their resentment. They saw their own divisions, often with superior combat records and more experienced leadership, being starved of resources, while SS formations, commanded by politically reliable but militarily mediocre officers, received everything they needed. The injustice was compounded when Wehrmacht divisions were then criticized for poor performance that resulted directly from inadequate support. More insidiously, the SS maintained its own intelligence network and reported directly to Hitler on military matters, often contradicting Wehrmacht assessments. SS officers had license to question the loyalty and commitment of Wehrmacht officers, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that made honest professional military discussions dangerous. A Wehrmacht general who expressed doubts about operational plans or suggested withdrawal from untenable positions risked being denounced to the SS as defeatist or traitorous. The SS intelligence reports to Hitler often contained information that contradicted Wehrmacht situation reports. When these discrepancies arose, Hitler invariably believed the SS version, assuming that Wehrmacht officers were either incompetent or lying to cover their failures. This meant that Wehrmacht commanders had to factor in not just military reality, but also how their reports would be perceived compared to SS versions. The result was that situation reports became political documents crafted to anticipate criticism rather than to provide accurate military information.